The call came in on a Tuesday morning, and the man on the other end of the line spoke with the kind of polished confidence that comes from years of managing schedules, expectations, and egos. He represented the NBA. He had a simple request. Marvin Gaye would perform the national anthem at the 1983 All-Star Game in Los Angeles. February 13th, the Forum, 17,000 people in the building, millions more watching on live television. It would be a moment, he said. Something tasteful, something traditional, something safe. He probably expected gratitude. He probably expected a yes, a thank you, and a brief conversation about logistics. Marvin listened. He didn't say much. He agreed to do it. What the man on the phone did not know, what none of them knew yet, was that Marvin had no intention of being tasteful. He had no intention of being traditional, and he had never, not once in his entire life, been safe. Safety was a concept designed for people who were afraid of what they might find if they looked too closely at themselves. Marvin had spent a lifetime looking too closely. There was nothing left to protect. The Forum in Inglewood was already buzzing with electricity by the time Marvin arrived backstage. Outside, the February air carried that particular Los Angeles chill that locals always underestimated, the kind that settled into your bones if you weren't paying attention. Inside, the arena smelled like popcorn and floor wax and anticipation. The halftime lights hadn't come up yet. The warm-up shots were still echoing from the hardwood. Security personnel moved in their usual orbits. Staff with clipboards checked off names against lists. Everyone was moving with the specific, purposeful energy of people who believed they had everything under control. They did not have everything under control. When Marvin's team communicated the setup to the event coordinators, the room shifted. There would be no live band, no orchestra behind him, no traditional arrangement, no full brass section, no choir standing at attention, just Marvin. And a drum machine. The silence that followed that announcement had its own weight. The coordinators exchanged glances. One of them, a man with a headset and a pressed shirt, leaned forward and said with great diplomatic patience that this was the national anthem, that there were protocols, that millions of people were watching, that a drum machine was not, under any reasonable interpretation, an appropriate accompaniment for the Star-Spangled Banner. He said all of this calmly, professionally, and with the quiet authority of someone who had managed large events for a long time and had never once had a performer challenge the fundamental architecture of what he was trying to execute. Marvin looked at him the way a river looks at a dam, patient, certain, already knowing how this ends. He wasn't being difficult, he wasn't being arrogant, he was being precise. Because Marvin Gaye understood something about music that most people in that building, with their clipboards and their headsets, and their carefully managed timelines, had never fully grasped. He understood that the most powerful thing a voice could do was not fill a room, it was stop one. And you couldn't stop a room with something predictable. You could only stop it with something true. The argument went back and forth for a while. Voices were raised, then lowered. Compromises were suggested, then rejected. Someone mentioned tradition. Someone else mentioned the broadcast window. A third person mentioned, very pointedly, that this was being watched by an enormous national audience and that any deviation from the expected format would reflect poorly on everyone involved. Marvin let them talk. He had been letting people talk his entire career. At Motown, when Berry Gordy told him to keep singing pop and stay in his lane. In the studio, when producers handed him material that felt hollow and expected him to make it shine through sheer professionalism. In meeting rooms across Detroit and Los Angeles, where men in suits looked at him and saw a commodity, a voice to be pointed at a market and fired like a carefully calibrated instrument. He had listened to all of them. He had nodded at all of them. And then he had gone into the recording booth and done exactly what he needed to do. This was no different. What none of the coordinators fully understood was the specific gravity of what Marvin was carrying into that building on that particular night. The early 1980s had not been kind to him. The tax debts, the divorces, the exile in Belgium, the cocaine, the paranoia that had followed him from Austin back to Los Angeles like a shadow he couldn't outrun. The Grammy wins for Sexual Healing had felt, to outsiders, like a triumphant comeback. To Marvin, they had felt like proof that he could still function, which was a different and smaller thing than triumph. He had moved back into his parents' house on Gramercy Place. He was still trying to put himself back together one piece at a time. And now he was standing in the bowels of the Great Western Forum, arguing with event coordinators about a drum machine. The conversation eventually ended the way those conversations always ended with Marvin. Not with a victory for either side, exactly. More like a mutual, exhausted recognition that the performer was going to do what the performer was going to do, and that no amount of bureaucratic pressure was going to change that fundamental reality. The coordinators stepped back. The headsets crackled with last-minute adjustments. Someone muttered something under their breath that no one acknowledged, and Marvin walked toward the stage entrance with the drum machine track cued and his voice the only other thing he was bringing with him. He paused once just before the tunnel opened onto the court. He stood still for a moment in the dim corridor light, the crowd noise washing over him like a tide. Then he rolled his shoulders, exhaled slowly, and walked forward. The crowd noise was enormous as he stepped out. 17,000 people generating the kind of ambient roar that fills an arena like water fills a vessel, rising and spreading into every corner. The television cameras tracked him. The lights hit him. He was wearing something simple, understated, which somehow made him more visible, not less, the way a single candle in a dark room draws the eye more completely than a chandelier. He took his position at the microphone. The drum machine started. One beat, two beats. A slow, deliberate pulse that sounded nothing like what anyone in that arena had been expecting. It was sparse, almost minimal. It left enormous amounts of space around itself, and in that space something interesting began to happen. 17,000 people, who had been in various states of conversation and movement and distraction, started to go quiet. Not all at once. In waves. The way silence spreads through a crowd when something unexpected is happening and people aren't quite sure yet what it is, but their instincts are telling them to pay attention. Then Marvin opened his mouth. What came out was not a performance of the national anthem. It was a conversation with it. He took that melody, that familiar, technically demanding, so often mangled sequence of notes, and he pulled it apart and rebuilt it from the inside. He slowed it down. He let the notes breathe. He put soul into the spaces between the words, into the held vowels, into the places where most singers rush because they were afraid of the silence. He was not afraid of the silence. He lived in it. He had been living in it for years. His voice did things to that song that it had never had done to it before on a stage that size. There were moments of almost unbearable tenderness, phrases where his tone dropped so low and so intimate that the 17,000 people in the arena became collectively a single listener leaning slightly forward. There were other moments where he opened up the full scope of what his voice could do, not as a demonstration of technical ability, but as a release, the way pressure releases when something finally gives. The drum machine held the pulse beneath all of it, steady and unhurried, the musical equivalent of a heartbeat. The coordinators were watching from the side of the stage. The man with the headset, the man with the clipboard, the people who had spent an hour explaining protocols and traditions and the expectations of a national television audience. They were watching Marvin do something that their protocols had no category for, and they were not saying anything. Because there was nothing to say, you cannot argue with what is happening in front of you when what is happening in front of you is undeniable. The song built. It always builds. The anthem, it's written that way, toward that final phrase that lands like a door swinging open onto something vast. And when Marvin reached it, when he arrived at that last sustained note and let his voice carry it out over 17,000 people who had by now gone almost completely silent, something happened in that arena that no broadcast timeline had accounted for. They erupted, not the polite, appreciative applause of an audience that has witnessed something competently executed, not the dutiful standing ovation of people who feel obligated to respond to a national symbol. Something rawer and more involuntary than that. The kind of sound a crowd makes when they have just witnessed something that reorganized, in some small but permanent way, their understanding of what was possible. The ovation went on. It went on past the point where it would normally have tapered off. Players on the court were looking at each other with expressions that said they had just experienced something they weren't fully prepared for. The television cameras held on Marvin's face. He stood at the microphone, not moving, absorbing the sound coming back at him the way a surface absorbs light. He had walked into that building carrying the weight of the last several years. The legal battles, the exile, the paranoia, the carefully managed collapse, and the even more carefully managed reconstruction. He had walked in carrying all of that, and he had stood in front of 17,000 people and a national television audience, and he had told all of them, without using a single word that wasn't already in the song, exactly who he was. Not a pop commodity, not a romantic persona crafted in a corporate meeting room, not a voice to be pointed at a market, a man, a specific, complicated, profoundly gifted man who had been through things that most people watching could not imagine, and who had come out the other side still capable of this, still capable of standing at a microphone and making 17,000 people hold their breath. The coordinators, to their credit, did not say anything afterward about the drum machine. What Marvin Gaye did with the national anthem on February 13th, 1983, did not just become a cultural touchstone in the immediate sense. It opened a door that has never fully closed. Every artist who has since brought personal interpretation to that song, every performance that has treated the anthem as a vehicle for genuine expression rather than a ritual to be correctly executed, carries some measure of what happened in the forum that night. Marvin didn't just sing a song, he demonstrated, in front of the largest possible audience, that the most powerful thing an artist could bring to any material was an uncompromising commitment to their own truth. That you could take something everyone thought they already knew and reveal, with the right kind of honesty, that they had never really heard it at all. The drum machine, the sparse arrangement, the voice with nothing hiding behind it. It should not have worked by any of the rules that the people with the clipboards and the headsets were operating under. But rules are written by people who are imagining the average of what's possible. Marvin Gaye was never interested in the average of what was possible. He walked off that stage and back into his life, which was still complicated, still unresolved, still carrying the weight it had always carried. The problems did not dissolve in the light of what he had just done. They rarely do. But for the length of that performance, standing at a microphone in front of the world with nothing but a drum machine and everything he had left inside him, Marvin Gaye had answered every person who had ever told him what he could and could not do with the only response that has ever actually mattered. He had shown them. Have you ever had to fight a whole system just to show them your true soul? Tell us your story in the comments.